Hey, hi everyone. So I'm back. We're gonna get back to that chapter one PowerPoint. So I'm gonna share my screen here, and then just going to. Okay, we're gonna go back to. So till it loads. So the last slide that I was talking about is this historical fiction book called Amelia Peabody's Egypt, a compendium that's linked to that book series that the previous few slides have talked about. Both the series and this book is written in very similar narrative style. So basically, either getting this book or getting a book from one of the series is a good way to gauge if you're gonna like Amelia Peabody or Elizabeth Peters as an author. Because if you get this book and you don't really like the style and kind of how it's written, it's a good bet that you're probably not going to like the other books in the series. If you do get this book and you absolutely love the way that it's written and you really like it, it's a good bet that you'll enjoy the other books in the main series as well. So these are just some other key dates, more back in antiquity rather than in the 19th and 20th century. The key date here is probably that 31 BC, because it's either in 31 BC or 32 BCE that the Battle of Actium occurs. So that's the famous battle with Antony and Cleopatra, where they try to go against Octavian, who becomes Augustus. And it's after that battle that Egypt is a province of the Roman Empire, and then it will basically pass through a succession of foreign hands. And as I was talking about before, it really won't be until 1952 or 1953 that the Egyptian state, with all its infrastructure like the Suez Canal, is back fully in control in Egyptian hands. Um, and then in the 600s, that's when the Arab or Muslim forces come in. As I said, you have Napoleon's expedition from 1798 to 1801. Then you have Muhammad Ali and his dynasty that sort of carve out a semi-independent fiefdom of Egypt, starting in 1805. And then I was talking about before, in terms of the Western powers, roughly from 1799 to about 1830, Britain and France are the main imperialistic powers that are competition over Egypt. And then, as I was talking about, it's really Britain that militarily wins that. So they start their formal occupation in 1882. But one of the terms of kind of the treaty that arises from that is they let France keep control of a lot of the cultural parts of Egyptology, like heading the antiquity service. So from roughly from 1839 on, even though Muhammad Ali is still the technical ruler and still technically in control, the different European powers, primarily Britain, have really started to advance into Egypt and have a good hold on different parts of the Egyptian state. 1848 is kind of another rough key year, because it's after that date that France draws back militarily, and Britain is clearly militarily in control. 1854 is the British forces put the first railway route in Egypt. 1859 is when construction on the Suez Canal starts, and 1869 is when the canal is fully built. So the Suez Canal is really what allowed the different Western powers and nations to solidify their grip and their hold on Egypt, because it gave them a transportation network straight in and out of Egypt, of ships and goods and things like that. And then roughly in the second half of the 1800s, you also have the growth of tourism as an industry in Egypt and in other places, particularly for Western tourists, and that is also entangled with imperialism and racism. So in 1869 is when Thomas Cook uses his travel company to take his first group of tourists to Egypt, and very soon after that, the Cook and Sons company becomes the main tourist and travel company for Westerners. And if you read the Amelia P. Body books, you'll hear mentions of them as well. By 1879, Britain has officials in place in Egypt, so their grip on the country has solidified even more, and they're mostly in control of its financial sources. And then in 1882 is when you have the British occupation that officially begins. Or 1882. Starting in the 1890s is when you do have some criticism against the British occupation that kind of starts to rev up. In 1914, Egypt is declared a protectorate of Great Britain. Part of that has to do with the geopolitics of World War I. And then in 1919 to 1922 is when a formal independence movement by Native Egyptians starts. So again, if you read the Amelia Peabody books, some of her later books, when her children are grown, or at least in their late teens, deal with aspects and different historical names of that movement as well. So then, as I said, in 1922, the Great Britain says, okay, Egypt is independent. You're now an independent kingdom. Sultan Fuad I is proclaimed king of Egypt, but there's still British and other non-Egyptian forces that are in control of the Suez Canal. So it's by 1956, Egypt has taken full control of the Suez Canal, and so now they're fully independent because they have full control of all their infrastructure. And then in 1969, Zahi Hawass becomes the first Egyptian head of the Antiquities Service. He maintains that post until 2011. And in 2011, as part of the fallout from the Mubarak unseating, Zahi Hawass loses that head of Antiquities Service post, and there's currently another native Egyptian that is in charge of the Antiquities Service. So going back to the 1999 film with Brendan Fraser, just a kind of reminder, the movie opens in 1923. So in sort of the universe of that film, British occupation had already been in place for decades, and it's the year or so before Egypt had been declared an independent kingdom. But you have, at least in the universe of the film, that history of imperialism. So I think his name is Wilson, but the pilot that Brendan Fraser enlists help from, that's British national, that's kind of part of the backstory of why he's in Egypt. He's part of that imperialist British forces history. You also have to think about the Western tourism industry that by 1923 has been in place for 50 plus years. And it's in the 1920s that Americans, both as tourists and archaeologists, or at least both archaeologists and then funding archaeological digs, are starting to come onto the scene as well. So if you remember, they're on the boat with the American cowboys as sort of one of their rivals. That can speak to a larger historical truth of kind of the arrival of the Americans onto the scene. So if you want primary accounts of this, there are actually a fair amount of primary sources. So of people who went to Egypt from roughly 1800 to 1950s, and then they wrote an account of their travels in a journal or some sort of book. And then that book journal got into a museum or library collection somewhere and got digitized and now is available online to read. So some places that you can go to find these tourist accounts is the Internet Archive, which is a website where they've taken publications that are in the public domain, they've scanned them, and then they've um, converted those into PDFs. And so you can either read the books online or you can download the PDFs as well. You also have the Library of Congress digital collections. They have a fair amount of travel accounts that you can read. And then the New York Public Library digital collections has travel accounts to Egypt as well. So if you read those travel accounts, you do, whether it's from the British perspective or the French or one of the European nations, or even from an American perspective, you do kind of get some assumptions that crop up again and again throughout the 19th and 20th century. So things that the European or American writer just kind of accepts as true. So Egypt has different races, and because these are literally some of the words that are used in these accounts, and those races, have innate good and bad characteristics. You also have this idea that there is a kind of rung of civilization, so it sort of goes in a straight line or a ladder and kind of evolves straight up. You also have the assumptions that the pharaonic Egyptians were glorious, and that speaks to a larger thing that happened in Egyptology, where the ancient Egyptian culture was basically reclassified as a white culture instead of Black culture, even though it was in a larger continent of Africa. So you sort of have this dichotomy in the accounts where the pharaonic or the ancient Egyptians, were kind of the apex, and then when Muslim rule came in, it threw everything haywire. Again, to uncover the good qualities of the natives, and again, natives is a word that crops up in these accounts over and over. The assumption is that can be done by the European or the American, but they have to be firm in tone and show display their sort of higher rung of evolvedness. And then you also have the question that you see all the way back in some of the accounts that came from Napoleon's Egypt, which is, did the original Egyptians come from Asia or Africa, i.e., were they white or Black? So this speaks to that racial history and kind of racist entanglements that we talked a little bit about with Petrie as well. So now the next chunk of slides looks at some of the aspects of visual culture from this period of tourism that I've been able to find. So these are just some things to think about as you're viewing these images, as it kind of speaks to these larger cultural questions. So this is from sometime in the early 20th century. So you have a group of American or European tourists that are in front of the Sphinx on that Giza plateau. And then you have the native Egyptian guides that, again, are doing most of the labor. So it speaks to that growth of the tourism industry, which goes hand in hand with greater European control of the country by the British, in particular. This is a postcard that kind of makes fun of this tourism industry. So you sort of have a portly German, that's posing all serious in front of the pyramids. So it's kind of making fun of that industry a little bit. This is from 1795, so we went back in time, and it's a political cartoon, and it talks about basically that Britain is eyeing Egypt and is in competition with France for Egypt as a colonial type possession to control. This is a personal photo from a family album who went to Egypt sometime between 1835 and 1898. So this, I think, is a picture of one of their guides with maybe his son. This is an image from 1836, and it's from a pretty famous account of Egypt by William Lane, called An Account of the Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians. And so this is just sort of sketch of one of the women that he saw in Egypt, and kind of what she was wearing. This is a newspaper blurb link about Muhammad Ali from 1839. This is a colored lithograph, and it says the Egyptian beauty, because one of the things that you'll notice early on about Western tourism culture in the 19th century and into 20th is it really sexualizes ancient or native Egyptian women in particular, and sort of this image develops of kind of the exotic and sensual East. And so this lithograph and kind of the caption that's on it speaks to kind of that way of looking at things. This is from 1841. It's from Punch magazine, which is a British political type scene. Again, it's kind of making fun of the bumbling Western tourist a little bit. So you see here, they're crossing maybe part of the Nile, and the guide is kind of doing all the work. And, the Western tourist gentleman is clearly not being presented in the best light here. This is another colored lithograph from 1843. So this is an early airplane that's flying over the Giza Plateau. So again, this speaks to greater Western penetration and greater Western technology throughout Egypt that really ramps up when the Suez Canal is finished, and once the British put in a lot of the major rail road routes as well. This is from a guidebook by Wilkinson, who is a pretty famous early Egyptologist. So he went to Egypt sometime in the 1840s, and he wrote a guidebook about his experiences and kind of his travels. But it's at this point where you still have the annual flood, which you can tell by the caption. So by about 1900, you have at least one dam that has been put in that really means that annual flood no longer happens, or at least no longer happens to the same degree. Definitely by the 1960s, when kind of that last major dam and the subsequent creation of Lake Nasser occurs, you really no longer have the annual flood as a cultural feature of Egypt at all. And so one of the other things that these travel accounts are good for is you see snippets about how Egypt changes its landscape during the flood kind of the earlier back you go. These are newspaper articles that talk about different geopolitical politics of the time. So this is from 1860, but it's a lithograph that is referencing Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt, at the end of the 1700s. This is 1862, showing some sort of celebration in Cairo. This is a painting that's commemorating the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. This is a stereograph, which is like an early photo. So this is someone who went to Egypt and took basically these early pictures sometime between 1850 and 1875. But the caption is interesting because it's ruined. Sorry, I need to get something to drink. It's ruined mosque in the desert. So again, it speaks to that idea that I talked about before, that sort of Muslim rule is somehow degenerate, and the Muslim religion is not as good as the Christian one. All right, I'm just going to flip through the rest of these kind of quickly. Again, if you want to take the class, you can download the PowerPoint and look at these in more detail. But basically, they all reference that tourism culture. But the images go all the way until or through the 1920s. These are just some of the early photographers of Egyptian monuments. So when photography as a technology was getting started, this is a good secondary source by Chris Naughton that really looks at these early Egyptologists and the kind of images that they took and their entanglement again with those larger geopolitical forces of kind of their day. So it's not cheap, but I definitely recommend it. Okay, so now I'm going to go a little bit into Egypt's geography in terms of the geography of country, both in more ancient times and then to some extent today as well. So another seriously recommended secondary source, which is Anatomy of Ancient Egypt, the third edition, 2018 by Barry J. Kemp. Again, it's more on the pricey side, but it has very good visuals that incorporate a lot of the recent archaeological work that's been done in Egypt on a lot of sites. And it touches on a lot of the things, some of which I've talked about in this video. And it's just a really, really good book. So if you're in any way a fan of ancient Egypt, it's one that I definitely recommend picking. So a couple of things that kind of mark the cultural geography of Egypt, some more in ancient times than now. Sorry, I gotta get more water. Is the Nile River. So even though there's no longer the annual flood in Egypt, the Nile River is still there and it still affects life in Egypt to some extent. But back before the dams were put in place, without the Nile River there, you wouldn't have been able to have agriculture. You wouldn't have been able to have that growth of people and that urban growth. Um, Egypt also has somewhat natural barriers to invasion. Again, this has played more into their more ancient history rather than their more modern. So you have the deserts on either side, which before things like airplanes or cavalry or large armored vehicles. Basically, when the only way to get a large army across was on foot, the deserts were a major barrier to that because once you get far enough in, you're going to need things like water and other supplies to keep your army from dying from the heat. And so one of the things that you'll see in Egyptian culture, as opposed to, say, the ancient Fertile Crescent, we would kind of call the larger Middle East, is that Egypt does not have a history of large scale invasion. While they do have outside contacts and links, trade links and others with different areas and chunks outside of their borders, um, they they're not invaded by large scale armies over and over in their ancient past. And so this gives Egyptian culture time to really cement those motifs that you see pop up again and again. They also have the cataracts along the Nile, which are basically these spots where there's rocks. And so, again, large scale naval fleets and boats can't get over those cataracts. So, to get past the cataracts, you basically have to disembark and carry the boat on land. And there's only certain times of the year where even a small boat can get through those areas. You also see an Egyptian culture because you see it on the landscape, and it's something that's very apparent, is kind of the arid desert versus the lush delta. And again, that flows from where the Nile River is. And so you see that interplay as a cultural motif very early in Egyptian culture and really all the way past the New Kingdom. You also have Egypt that's divided into two regions. And again, these are terms that the ancient Egyptians used and that Egyptology still uses to a good extent. So you have Upper Egypt, which, because of the way that the Nile runs, Upper is actually down here. So it's roughly equivalent to where Thebes kind of is. And then Lower Egypt is actually up here on the delta. And so it's roughly where like modern Cairo is and ancient Memphis was. This is a link that I'm not going to play now, but it does, partly because it's somewhat long, but it does give you a good idea of kind of the geography of the Nile River and the kind of ecosystems that it created. This is a much shorter video that basically talks about those things that I just mentioned. So the annual flood and the Nile River and kind of the effects that has on the geography of Egypt. This is the entire course of the Delta, or the entire course of the Nile. So this is basically this fertile band of Egypt. And so this is where the land that you can grow crops on is. And then there's the kind of the largest fertile region at one of the mouths of the Nile, where so here. So this is Lower Egypt, and this goes all the way down to where the Nile starts, which I think is in modern day Ethiopia, if I am remembering correctly. So a lot of archaeological remains, particularly tombs, are out in the desert. And so that's why a lot of them are better preserved, because people don't return to this part over and over to grow crops on a massive scale, whereas they do in the Delta. The water table is also higher in the Delta, so it's more expensive to do excavations here, because when you get down to a certain level, you're going to have water flowing in. So you have to have a water pump basically going all the time to deal with that water table. Whereas if you're excavating a site out in the desert, you don't have to deal with that extra cost. This is a map that shows you more particularly where Upper and Lower Egypt are. So as I said, the way the Nile runs, Lower Egypt is actually up here, so where the Delta is. It was where, particularly in the Old Kingdom, the capital of Memphis was. It's where Giza is, and it's roughly where modern day Cairo is as well. And then you have Upper Egypt that's further down, and it's roughly where modern day Luxor and the general Theban or Thebad region is. And then when you get down here, you're getting into what the Egyptians called Nubia, but what is now, at least part of it, modern day Sudan. So this is just, this is a map of Egypt and some of the main sites and some of the main towns. But what I like about it is it shows the desert on either sides, the Western Desert, Eastern Desert, and then down into the Nubian Desert as well. But this shows a lot of the main archaeological sites that are along that Nile River zone. And then when you get into here, you're getting into modern day Israel. This is from a journal article that just goes a little bit more into the geography of the different Nile branches. So in ancient times, there were about 7 that were in operation. Currently, only I think 2 of these are active, so only the Rosetta and the Dalmatia branches. So that's what these numbers are, is they're referring to all the branches of the Nile that were active in antiquity, most of which have now silted up or are rendered inaccessible in some way. This is again referring to the environment and kind of how it changed through time. So it starts until about 2000, and then it ends, from around 3000. And it looks in particular, this is in particular around the area of Memphis, which was the ancient capital. So where modern day Cairo is, kind of that general area. This is a graphic that talks about and maps the possible migration of the Nile, because the Nile channels and the way that the water flowed has changed through time. So a lot of the pyramid sites that are now out in the desert, in antiquity, they were close to a functioning Nile source or a Nile branch or some functioning water source that is simply not there anymore. So it starts way back in the Neolithic. So before Egypt unified to become a state, and then it goes all the way to 2005. And again, this is looking particularly at that Memphis, modern day Cairo kind of area. This is a map that it's from an article that's looking at what happened in the Western Desert. And so that's why you see it here. But when you get to here, it shows you basically the different regions of Egypt. So this is the Thebad region. So roughly where modern day Luxor and Karnak are. This again is another article that just talks a little bit more about the different ecology zones of current day Egypt and kind of how the Nile River plays into that. This is a tomb relief, and it speaks to something that I referenced a few slides earlier, which is that fertility of the Nile and the delta is something that you see depicted on a lot of tomb walls from the Old Kingdom on. So this is from an Old Kingdom type of tomb that's called a mastaba, and this is the tomb owner's family, so the gentleman that was buried here, and they are out on the Nile River enjoying some fishing or just some leisure time. But this image probably does have larger theological and sacred meanings as well. But basically, you see elements of that Nileolithic landscape, and they're in some kind of boat or skiff here as well. This is from the New Kingdom, so it's from another tomb. We're going at least 1,000 years later in time. But again, it's the tomb owner and his wife and maybe his daughter or one of his kids, and they're doing fishing in the marshes. And again, you get that Nileolithic landscape. Again, probably not just a pretty picture, but has theological and kind of sacred meanings that have since been lost to us as. And then I talked about the cataracts that are along the Nile River. So there's 6 big ones, and so those are areas again where there's rock accretions, and there's only certain times of year where you can get even a small boat through, or where you could get even a small boat through before the annual flood. And you can see like it's not, you can't get a major naval fleet through there. So if you want to go kind of the off times, you have to get out of the boat, disassemble it, walk it past the cataracts, and then get back in. So this is the first cataract someone in modern times went there and took a picture of it. But this also gives you a sense of the fertility of the Nile with kind of that desert on either side. This is a map that shows the 6 main cataracts. And so that's what the numbers are. So the first one, the second one, third one, fourth one, the fifth one, and then the 6th. This is another image of a cataract, again, modern tourist, and this gives you those contrasts a little bit more as well in terms of the effect that the Nile still has on the landscape, even though we no longer have that annual And that annual flood really was key to agriculture in ancient times, because what would happen is the Nile would flood. The water would recede, but then what would be left behind would be this amazingly fertile silt in the delta and in these agricultural areas that the Egyptians could then use to plant crops in. And the flooding was fairly regular and not super disruptive as compared to, say, the flooding in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what we kind of call the modern Middle East, which is why Herodotus calls Egypt the gift of the Nile, because that really was true to a large extent. So this is from 19th or early 20th century person that went to Egypt before all the dams were put in. And so this gives you a sense of what Egypt looked like when the Nile was in flood. And you can see that it's in Cairo. So it's in that Memphis region. This is from an article, it's from 65. So towards the tail end of when kind of the last of the dams were put in. So this is the river Nile, and it's flooding all these fields. So this is something that would happen on a large scale in ancient Egypt, is the Nile would flood the fields, water would recede, and what would be left behind would be this really fertile soil that the Egyptians would then plant crops in. So this gives you some sense of what the landscape looked like for at least part of the year for the ancient Egyptians. This is a pie chart that breaks down the Egyptian seasons, because those, of course, were based on the flooding of the Nile. So you have the season of Akhet, which is when the Nile flooded. Then you have the part of time when the waters receded. And it was time to plant your crops, which is the Shamu. And then you have the season of Peret, which is when those crops would, flourish, and you could harvest them and then wait for the next flood to, start the cycle again. I'm not going to read all of these, but these are from some travel accounts from 18th or from 19th, early 20th century that talk about aspects of the annual flood as it was still observable when. So again, I've put these clips here to kind of give you a sense of what it was like. So again, if you want to read them yourself, then you can. I've put the account that the quotes have come from as well, and the date if you want to go on the Internet Archive, because that's where most of these are from to read the full travel account. I'm in 2011, I actually had a chance to go to Egypt. So this is a picture that I took when I was going back and forth from one of the sites in the car. And so the tour guide was driving, but I just took a quick snapshot of, again, the contrast in the landscape, and you can still see, a bit of the Nile River, Nile tributary here as well. So even though the annual flood no longer happens, you still see the effect of the Nile on modern day Egypt in terms of the fertility of the land and those geographical contrasts. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about current Egyptology and some challenges that it has. So something that I briefly referenced, which is we have a high number of preserved burials. We don't have a lot of preserved settlement sites or a lot of preserved full temples. And that is for a couple of reasons. So one, it's because, or it's partly due to the materials with which these structures were all built in antiquity. So both, particularly prior to the New Kingdom, both temples and even high status buildings were built of limestone and or mud brick. So these organic materials that don't really survive weathering and kind of the ages all that well. And as Egypt was urbanized in the 19th century, a lot of that mud brick was recycled for factory use and kind of for other things, or it's just sort of cleared from the landscape as the population grew. We also have, right after the what we call pharaonic Egypt, so kind of post New Kingdom, we have limestone that was taken from temples and other sites to extract the lime. So even late in antiquity, we have plundering of these different site materials that affects what's now left. We also have, even during the pharaonic period, in particular for temples, pharaohs would take parts of earlier temples and basically claim those materials or repurpose them to have their own built. So even during pharaonic times, you saw patterns of reuse that affects the long-term survival of these buildings. You also do have in late antiquity, so in the late 300s AD, you have Christianity that comes onto the scene in Egypt. A lot of the large limestone temples are closed. Some are targeted sort of for defacement or destruction, at least in part, by Christians, but probably not to the extent that we think that happened. So while there is some deliberate defacement, particularly by some monks, it's probably not as high as earlier belief thought it was. In terms of why we have a very high number of burial remains versus a low number of settlement site remains, it goes back to something that I alluded to earlier, which is there's only a certain amount of agricultural land. And so those settlement sites and spots tend to be reoccupied over and over and over. And so you have earlier layers, earlier levels that are simply lost to time. And then I also talked about how in the Delta, those earlier layers, earlier settlement sites are more likely to be under the present water table, meaning that it's simply more costly to excavate settlement types there than it is to excavate a tomb site out in the desert. You also have the fact that before the kind of the rise of scientific archaeology with Petrie and kind of people who thought like him, you have a lot of the first half of the 18th century, first half roughly of the 19th, you have came to dig in Egypt, we're looking for the shiny stuff. So a lot of the organic materials, a lot of the everyday life stuff was simply viewed as not important and was just kind of tossed to the side. So these are just some examples of things like mud brick and other materials that have managed to survive all of these vagaries that I just talked about to kind of give you some idea of the main building material and what was once there. So this is from the Middle Kingdom. It's a mud brick, and it's stamped with the seal impression of the office of the vizier. So you can just kind of see the stamp seal impression here. And I think it was originally excavated by Petrie. It's currently in the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology. And that's probably one of the reasons why we have this particular brick, because as I said, Petrie was one of the first ones to say, no, the everyday life stuff is important too, and pottery is important, and it should all be recorded, should all be saved to the best of our ability. This is a brick from the New Kingdom, and it has the cartouche, which is basically a way of marking a royal name. And so the cartouche part is this kind of circle here. And then the actual name of the New Kingdom ruler of Thutmose III is within the cartouche. So here. That's how we can date this particular brick to the New Kingdom, because we know that Thutmose III lived in the time that Egyptologists have decided is called the New Kingdom. This is another type of brick, and this is unbaked clay mixed with straw from the third intermediate, and it has the seal of a husband and a wife here, so it has their names. One of the other ways that we get at the sort of how they did everyday life, even if we don't have all the bricks and kind of all the architecture from the actual sites, so we have these things called tomb models, because the Egyptian idea of the afterlife was that it would be very much like your life on Earth. So you would enjoy the same station in the afterlife that you enjoyed on Earth, and so you would need all of your stuff. You would need models of household tasks, because you would still want bricks and things like bread to be made for you. So this is a model that was found in a tomb, and these men are making bricks. So this is one of the ways that kind of we get at how architecture in ancient Egypt and kind of the crafts worked. This is from, I think, a New Kingdom, and it's a fasciole. It's a fasciole, and it's from a tomb wall, but it's another brick making scene. This is a brick mold from a foundation deposit. So again, kind of in indirect way. This is a architectural plan for a garden. So you can see the kind of outlines of the plan here. This is a tile maybe from the site of Marna, because as I said, even the high status buildings like palaces and fancy buildings, their basic material was mud brick. And then of course what made them fancy was you would put all the fancy furniture, and you would put all the fancy tiles, and all those fancy layers to make it bold and beautiful. But the basic building material was still that organic mud brick. And so you have to imagine that in all these palaces and basically in all these elite buildings would be covered with tiles like this. That's what would make them so beautiful. And again, these, depending on when the site was dug and kind of who dug it, we have greater or lesser survivability for a lot of the interior furnishings and kind of interior decoration. So these are more fancy tiles that are definitely from the site of Marna. So again, to kind of give you at least some idea of just how opulent and lavish the interior of some of these elite buildings would have been. This is from this is a door drum section, because again, a lot of the things like doorways and the infrastructure of buildings have not survived even temples. So that's why I've kind of put these here to kind of give you an idea of the framework that would have held a lot of these buildings together. These are links to more objects like this that, again, if you want to download the PowerPoint and kind of take your time to look through these, you can. A broken donkey bag. So a lot of the bags, a lot of the containers that the average Egyptian used would have been made of organic materials. So they would have been made of fabric or maybe straw. And so again, those don't have very high survivability. These are two links that take you to the reconstruction in 3D of two sites, and they're more elite sites. So it again gives you some idea of just how colorful and kind of how imposing these sites would have looked when they were being used. So that is the end of this PowerPoint. And the next video will be a little bit more introduction, where I will go over the basics of hieroglyphs as well as the basics of the chronology of pharaonic, i.e. Egypt. But I hope that you enjoyed this, and I'm going to unshare the screen, and hopefully I will see you next time.